This is the man behind the art of the deal. The man who, along with distinguished stops along the way at the New York Times, New Times, at New Times, not High Times, he reminded me, New Times, Newsweek, the New York Times, now's the time to applaud, and the New York Times Magazine. Right, among other places, did more than almost anyone else, some might say, to make Donald Trump our president. I'm sorry. I'm affecting him. That's not fair. It's not fair. I'm sorry. Tony, please forgive me. Please. I will throw myself on my sword. But you can explain why it's not fair and why it's not even true. But he has lots to say about that experience and its aftermath and how it has affected him, which may be even the most interesting things that he has perhaps never really explored deeply, the psychology of Tony Schwartz. So, don't throw anybody, because he does have so many admirable attributes. So I give you the Tony Schwartz.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, including the very significant number of you I grew up alongside as a reporter in the New York City of the 70s and 80s. The irony of being asked to address a group of journalists isn't lost on me. I actually feel both honored and moved by the invitation, but also very much aware of the complicated circumstances that prompted it to happen. The inescapable truth is that I will forever be best known not for any substantive journalism I've ever written, but for an act of casual complicity in which I created a largely fictional character who America ultimately chose to elect president. So I want to talk to you today about how I came to make the choice to write that book, what drew me to Donald Trump, how the arc of my life was permanently changed by that 18 months I spent in close proximity to him, and how reckoning with that experience profoundly influenced the person I've become and the work that I do. 3 questions have animated my life in the 3 decades since I wrote The Art of the Deal. Why are we the way we are? Who are we capable of becoming? And what stands in our way? In my own case, I grew up believing that I had a deep responsibility to be of service to others and to make a positive contribution in the world. I also grew up with a burning, sometimes desperate ambition to stand out individually, to be seen as special by as many people as possible, and to advance my own cause in the world. I've spent my life struggling with these powerful and contradictory impulses which grew out of my confusing and painful experience as a child. On the face of it, so if you weren't here for a psychological self-examination, I give you the opportunity to leave now, because you're going to get it. On the face of it, my 2 siblings and I were raised in privileged circumstances. My parents were intelligent, well-educated, successful in their careers. Some of you are aware that my mother, Felice, was the founder of Catalyst, which is remains very well known. And they were both highly respected in their communities. Both of my parents did admirable work. My father was a scientist and educator. My mother was all her life a passionate social activist and feminist who fought to make the world a more equitable place. But that was only part of the story. It was the public part, the external part. At home, my mother was a volatile, raging, and critical presence. Only much later in life did I come to understand that she was actually mentally ill and that I was not to blame, and that her punishing behavior was the legacy of having grown up with a volatile, raging, and critical mother of her own and a neglectful father. My own father was a kind and gentle man, but also passive and rarely present, and he had neither the insight nor the strength to protect me or my 2 siblings. He was as awed and frightened by my mother as my 2 siblings and I were. I was mesmerized by my mother's conviction, her certainty, and her ability to make things happen. And I was simultaneously terrified by her anger and her judgment. I desperately wanted to prove myself worthy of her love, but I never felt that was possible. And largely as a result, I never felt safe and secure in the world or in my own skin. To feel good enough, to feel valued and valuable, is our most fundamental need after food and shelter. Instead, I grew up burdened by a sense of inadequacy and a bottomless hunger to prove my value by way of visible external accomplishments. There are countless children who had more emotionally traumatizing childhoods than I did, including Trump. There are also many who grew up in more secure households with more consistently loving parents, and I hope that was true for as many of you as is possible. But here is the secret that dare not say its name, and it extends across all races, classes, cultures, and geographies. My story is your story, to one degree or another. We each suffer far more than we typically feel able to acknowledge, and that's because all parents fall short of unconditionally loving and protecting their children, and all children grow up feeling, to one degree or another, vulnerable, unsafe, insecure, and unworthy. This is built into the human experience. We will do almost anything to avoid these intolerable feelings. And so over time, we each build a self-protection plan, a way to protect ourselves from the intolerable feelings of emptiness or despair or loneliness or inadequacy. And to anesthetize ourselves, we may turn to alcohol or drugs, seek more money, acclaim, and power, mindlessly surf the web, post on social media, or play video games, work compulsively at expense to our most important relationships, and even martyr ourselves by taking care of others as a righteous way to circumvent the feeling of our own unmet needs. We co-opt our highest cognitive capacities in order to justify our worst behaviors, rationalizing, justifying, minimizing, deflecting, avoiding, and denying what we find too painful to acknowledge. We play a confidence game with ourselves, and none of us is free of these instincts. They're an unalterable part of being human. So I was focused on achievement from a very early age. I had my name on a column in the New York Post, the pre-Murdoch New York Post, when I was 23. I wrote cover stories for Newsweek beginning at 24. I became a reporter at the Times at the age of 26. I wrote all over the paper, for the book review, the magazine, Arts and Leisure, and on the news pages. I went on to write for New York and Esquire and Vanity Fair by the time I reached my early 30s. And I wrote my first book, the book you're aware of, when I was 34, and it became a #1 bestseller. But for all of these accomplishments, none of them seemed good enough for me to feel good enough. And none of them gave me a sense of security. I was 33 years old at the point I first met Donald Trump in 1985. Trump, by then, had attracted some local fame for building a hotel atop Grand Central Station and for building Trump Tower. I was a writer for New York Magazine, and I got wind that Trump had just purchased an older building overlooking New York Central Park South. It was a prize location, but the tenants in the building were living under the protection of rent control and rent stabilization, and they paid very little for their apartments. Trump's plan was to get rid of them and turn the building into a luxury condo. To help in that effort, he hired a company that specialized in what was then known euphemistically as tenant relocation. Encouraging and relocating tenants involved failing to replace burned out lights in the hallways, ignoring requests for maintenance inside tenants' apartments, and having elevators break down with suspicious frequency so that the mostly elderly tenants were forced to walk up and down multiple flights of stairs. At one point, Trump threatened to fill the apartments with homeless people and drug dealers. All this was, obviously, designed to make life so miserable for the tenants that they felt they had no choice but to eventually move out. Cruelty was a part of Trump's modus operandi from a very early stage. My article was merciless in exposing what Trump was doing, but also how ineffective he'd been. I referred to his efforts as a case study in how not to vacate a building, the story of a gang that couldn't shoot straight, a fugue of failure, a farce of fumbling and bumbling. The magazine's cover featured an illustration of Trump looking like a thug, red-faced, sweating, scowling. To my amazement, he loved the article. and especially the cover picture. He loved being portrayed as a tough guy, and almost immediately had that cover framed, and he put it up on a wall in his office, and only took it down probably in 2016 when I started speaking up. At the time, he also wrote me a fan note. Several months after the story, I went back to conduct the Playboy interview with Trump. A few minutes into our conversation, he mentioned he just signed a deal with Random House to do a book. "What's it about?" I asked. "It's my autobiography," he replied. "You're only 38 years old," I said. "You don't have an autobiography yet." "Yeah, I know," he replied, "but I'm getting paid a lot of money to do it." "Well, if I were you, and you were determined to do your autobiography," I said, "I think people would be a lot more interested in the deals you've made than your story. I'd call the book The Art of the Deal." The title literally had just popped into my head. "I like that," Trump said without missing a beat. "You want to write the book?" Talk about a moment. It all happened suddenly and totally unexpectedly, but in suggesting that title in that moment, I guess I was silently hoping he would find it intriguing. It was complicated. I already knew that Trump was a bad actor from my previous article. There was nothing that I found admirable or redeeming about him, even then. On the other hand, and although I wouldn't have acknowledged this at the time, and especially not to my journalistic colleagues, I was in some ways dazzled by the swaggering, renegade, unapologetic, over-the-top way that Trump lived. I debated with myself for several days, discussed the decision with my wife, with friends, with several colleagues. I don't remember any of them counseling me against doing the book. At the same time, I was aware that most of the journalists I knew and admired would not have agreed to work with Trump. And I suspect I didn't ask the ones who would have urged me not to do it. In the end, of course, I said yes. I summoned up what the writer Jonathan Haidt has called our inner lawyer to make the best possible case for me and to omit, minimize, or disparage the arguments not to do it. So my inner lawyer pointed out to me that my wife and I had a young child, a second about to arrive, and a mortgage we were struggling to pay with the modest salaries we earned as journalists. That I know you can appreciate. Writing Trump's book, my inner lawyer helpfully added, would give my family some financial security and potentially free me to write whatever book I wanted to write next. And how bad could it be to spend a year writing a book for a big-mouth real estate developer? It wasn't as if anyone took him seriously. But here is the simpler truth. To write that book, I pushed aside my concerns about the kind of man Trump was, and more important, the kind of man I wanted to be. My mother, bless her, was appalled by my choice. She disdained any focus on making money, and she saw Trump as nothing more than a vulgar loudmouth. In hindsight, I can see that writing The Art of the Deal was a perverse declaration of independence from my mother. I was effectively sticking my finger in her eye. Once the contract was signed, I arranged to meet Trump on Saturday mornings at his apartment in Trump Tower. My plan was to interview him for 2 or 3 hours at a time until I gathered enough material to write the book. I imagined it would take several dozen meetings over the subsequent 6 months, and I told him that. It didn't take long to realize I was kidding myself. In our very first interview, Trump got impatient within 3 minutes answering my questions. It was nearly impossible to keep him focused on any topic for more than a few minutes. He had, as you well know, a stunningly short attention span and virtually no capacity to reflect on his past. So after a half dozen frustrating interview sessions, it became clear I wasn't going to get a book's worth of material by interviewing Trump. Feeling stymied, I decided to simply show up at his office in the mornings and listen in on an extension to his phone calls. I don't remember asking him for permission. It was clear to me that if Trump could have had his way, the whole world would have been listening in on those phone calls. It was in the aftermath of those conversations that I began to see I couldn't take anything Trump told me at face value. To fill in the details on the deals I was listening to over the phone, I went to see the people he was talking to and with whom he made those deals. Almost invariably, they told me very different versions of the deals than Trump had told me, versions that were far less flattering to him. That made me uneasy, but my inner lawyer helpfully reminded me that this wasn't meant to be my version of the events, nor an objective account. This was Trump's version of the story, and my job was to tell it the best I could. More than any human being I have ever met, and you will ever meet, Trump has the ability to convince himself that whatever he's saying at any given moment is true, or sort of true, or at least ought to be true. As we all know now, lying is second nature to Trump, just one more way to gain advantage. For him, facts are whatever he deems them to be on any given day. When he's challenged, as he demonstrated again last week in the fight over the wall, he simply doubles down, utterly unfazed by the fact that what he's just said is demonstrably false. This is what makes Trump most dangerous. He lacks a conscience. His inner lawyer can justify anything, including reinventing reality. During the campaign in 2016, I was asked what I would rename The Art of the Deal if I had it to do over again. At the time, I wrestled with the answer to that question, and I came up with the title The Sociopath. But back when I was doing the book, I wrestled with how to tell these stories that I knew were full of inaccuracies. And eventually I came up with one sentence I'm sure all or most of you have heard, aimed at covering all potential untruths. It was this: people want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. It's called truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration and a very effective form of promotion. Trump loved that phrase. But of course, there was nothing innocent about it. It was a sleight of hand, a trumped-up euphemism for deceit. What I did so effectively in The Art of the Deal, I'm ashamed to say, was misuse my skill as a writer to refashion Donald Trump's bullying, cynicism, and one-dimensionality into a voice that was perceived by readers as boyish, ingenuous, and brashly charming. In the end, I created a character far more winning than Trump, the real Trump. And as I've reflected back, I now see that I shared some of Trump's neediness and hunger for affirmation. And I strongly suspect that he sensed this too, even if he couldn't articulate it, and that it made him more comfortable with me. For my part, observing those distasteful qualities in such an exaggerated version in Trump allowed me to feel more righteous about disowning them in myself. The qualities we find most repellent in others are often those we find it intolerable to see in ourselves. The ultimate motive for seeking extraordinary success, power, or fame, the psychologist Sue Bloland has written, is to make sure that our feared rejection, born in childhood, never happens. We want to believe that if we ourselves could just secure enough recognition and approval from the outside world, if we could feel sufficiently admired, we would be healed and our self-esteem secured. But no matter how great the success, the original narcissistic wound remains unhealed. Now, Bloland happens to be the daughter of the revered psychoanalyst Erik Erikson. Her insights grew out of observing the vast gulf between her father's enormous external success and his deep insecurity. This phenomenon is especially common, I believe, among men who've grown up with the pernicious cultural expectation that to be a real man, you must project an image of strength, toughness, and invulnerability. To experience oneself as weak or tender or vulnerable can feel shameful. Instead, as we've seen so publicly these past couple of years, many seemingly powerful men transmute these intolerable feelings of weakness into aggression and even violence against women. As president, Trump has more direct access than almost any human being alive to the power, attention, and even the adulation he so craves. But that's the equivalent of saying that a heroin addict has kicked the problem as soon as he has free and continuous access to the drug. In reality, any drug provides diminishing returns over time, and the addict must keep upping the dose in a fruitless effort to achieve the same high. and the same buffer from pain that the drug was meant to provide in the first place. Now, Trump grew up with a very powerful and brutal father and an overpowered and neglectful mother who didn't protect him or even pay much attention to him. I viscerally understand that dynamic, as you may guess, although the roles were reversed with my own parents. In Trump's case, he deduced that in order to survive, he had to go to war with the world. It was a binary choice. He either dominated or he submitted. He either created fear or he succumbed to fear, as his older alcoholic brother did. From early in his life, Trump determined that the best way to stay safe was to take no prisoners. As he does to this day, he treated every encounter as a contest he had to win, because the only other option was to lose, which was the equivalent to him of being obliterated. Unlike his older brother, Trump stood up to his father. He dominated his siblings, he became a bully in the neighborhood, and he remains a bully to this day. Trump's pain, though, was so overwhelming and intolerable that he pushed it out of his consciousness, even as it took a deep toll on him and a toll that he has gone on to inflict on all of us. Win or lose, dominators submit. This perspective remains the heart of Trump's internal narrative, the story he tells himself about who he is. When he looks out today, even as the President of the United States and the leader of the free world, he sees a jungle filled with predators that he must defeat in order to survive himself. This is why I believe he identifies so closely, so strongly, and admires autocrats like Putin and Kim Jong-un, who seem to have an invulnerability he knows he does not. Because Trump has spent his adult life avoiding self-reflection, the influence of his early experience is almost completely opaque to him. He has said that he is essentially the same person today at 72 that he was at 7. And this is one of the very few accurate insights he has ever had about himself. Each of us moves through early childhood with a narrow, self-centered worldview. That's the nature of development. In Trump's case, his view of the world congealed in his early childhood. The consequence was that he failed to develop virtually any of the qualities that we typically associate with adults, with healthy adults: the empathy, generosity, reflectiveness, the capacity to delay gratification, and above all, an inner sense of right and wrong. Over time, at the time, I felt an increasing sense of discomfort and even despair at working with Trump. But in an unexpected way, the experience of writing The Art of the Deal eventually proved to be a gift to me I could not have anticipated. It put into much bolder relief the sort of person I didn't want to be. It set me on a journey of growth that has become the central narrative of my life and work. For my next book, What Really Matters, Searching for Wisdom in America, I set out to write about people with lives grounded in a very different set of values than Trump's, seekers with more idealistic goals beyond their own immediate self-interest. The experience was inspiring in many ways, but it was also complicated. In the course of 5 years interviewing on Trump's dime from royalties, and getting to know scores of psychologists and philosophers, scientists and mystics who had spent their own lives searching for meaning, what I discovered was a good deal of complexity and contradiction. I met these people who were often stirring in their words, skilled in their practices, but who also devolved, like the rest of us, into more primitive behavior in the face of their own demons. Many of them remain nearly as blind to the contradictions between their walk and their talk as Trump did. At the most fundamental level, development, growth, is about consciousness. It's about seeing more and excluding less. Throughout our childhoods, seeing more happens predictably and almost automatically. A 10-year-old has a much more expansive worldview than a 5-year-old. And a 15-year-old sees much more than a 10-year-old. The widening, deepening, and lengthening of our perspective is what helps us to become more capable and whole human beings. But then somewhere around 18 or 20 or 21, something changes. The automatic part of development slows dramatically, and the culture, begins to see us as grown-ups, which is the way we want to be seen anyway after having lived under someone else's roof for what feels like so long. But being a grown-up also implies that we're not in the business of growing up anymore. By our early 20s, the die is deeply cast. We develop additional skills along the way, to be sure, as spouses, parents, in our work. But what doesn't typically change much is our worldview, our mindset, our sense of self. By the time we reach adulthood, we've unconsciously constructed a story about who we are and what we believe, and most of us spend the rest of our lives sticking to it. We look at the world through the relatively narrow lens we've created for ourselves and imagine that we're seeing the whole picture. It's called confirmation bias, and instinctively we seek this certainty because it makes us feel safer. As Paul Simon once put it, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. For the past 20 years, I've run a company called the Energy Project, which is focused on how to manage human energy. We go into large organizations and help people build their capacity physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And by the latter, we simply mean the energy derived from connecting to a purpose beyond one's immediate self-interest. Companies hire us in order to improve things like retention and employee engagement and ultimately performance, of course. But in truth, our work is more subversive than those outcomes suggest. What we're really trying to do is help people, and especially leaders, to become more conscious, to see through their blind spots and challenge their fears, their assumptions, and their limitations so they can become bigger human beings and behave better in the world. How else are we to survive? So here's the kind of challenge we put in front of leaders, and I'll put it in front of you now. Think for a moment about who you are at your best. Think just of 2 or 3 adjectives that would describe who you are when you show up at your best. And now think for a moment of 2 or 3 adjectives that would describe who you are at your worst. There's a huge gap between them, isn't there? You wouldn't want to be friends with that person who is you at your worst. And the truth is, you're not one or the other. Both of these selves are you, and we move between them depending on what's going on in our lives at any given moment. One of the great liberations of my own life was realizing that all of the worst stuff I'd ever thought about or felt about myself, or that others had said about me, was true. But it wasn't all that was true. There was also a better me. And the worst of me didn't negate the best of me. The more energy that we spend defending our value, the less energy we have to experience our value, and in turn, to add more value in the world. We can't change what we don't notice. Now, noticing can be painful and uncomfortable, but it also gives us the freedom to make more conscious choices about how to behave in the world. It allows us to say, this is my story, and I'm not sticking to it. For all the work I've done to see through my own blind spots, to be more conscious and less reactive, my worst impulses still rise up when I'm feeling most threatened and least secure. But I've also learned that when my value feels most at risk, when my instinct is to protect myself through aggression, the best move I can make is to surrender to those feelings of weakness rather than trying to bat them away. And to remind myself that the storm will pass and I will feel better if I haven't inflicted it first on others. This is the work we do inside organizations. In a world in which the complexity of the problems we are facing is running far out ahead of the complexity of thinking and the emotional maturity required to solve them, we try to help companies build growth cultures, environments in which people feel safe enough and supported enough to learn, develop, and evolve as human beings. This is the life that Donald Trump has never lived and never will, which is a tragedy for him and a worse tragedy for us. But we can, you can, we can see more and be more, no matter what our age and our circumstance. We can grow and evolve. The choice about who we want to be is one of the few choices that no one can ever take away from us. Loving oneself is no easy matter, the psychologist James Hillman has written, because it means loving all of oneself, including the shadow, where one is so inferior and so socially unacceptable. Thus, the cure is a paradox requiring two incommensurables: the moral recognition that parts of me are burdensome and intolerable and must change, and the loving, laughing acceptance of them, which takes them exactly as they are, joyfully, forever. One both tries hard and lets go, judges harshly and joins gladly. Our fate, our current narrative about who we are, the assumptions we hold, need not hold us. The stories we tell ourselves are not immutable facts. We can behave better in any given moment. At the end of Tony Kushner's Angels in America, the character Pryor reflects on the horrific wave of death caused by AIDS and the gay community's horrifying challenge in the face of so much loss. What he says feels to me poignantly relevant to the challenges we face today in the era of Trump. The world only spins forward, Pryor explains. We will be citizens. The time has come. Bye-bye now. You are fabulous creatures, each and every one, and I bless you. More life. The great work begins. So bless you too. More life. The great work begins. Thank you. Let me just say before I take questions that I've been doing successive versions of this talk for 2 years now. And it's, in the service of absolution. I know that sounds funny, but it's 100% serious. And I struggle with my composure.
Bless you too. Yeah.
Get it out. Because I'm doing it. Because I carry so much shame about what I did. And this audience is the one that I feel most ashamed in front of. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for your remarkable talk. My question might be a little unusual. I worked for your mother from 1988 to 1992. And of course, I don't know about any years before 1988 or being in her household. But I will share a story she would tell her then about 40-person, mostly women staff. And that the organization still exists, by the way. It's about 60 years old. She was definitely a visionary ahead of her time. We will agree on that. And she would quote a big number, which was an even bigger number then, but it's still a big number today, and say that that was what you turned down to write a second book with or about Donald Trump. And she was very proud of you for that, if I may say that. And I would just wonder if you could care to comment on any aspect of that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. Believe me, I remember that story. I remember calling my mother. It's interesting. I remember calling my mother. I was walking in the park with Trump, who wanted me to write the second book. And it's actually, I think, the only time he may have walked freely in Central Park ever. You know, he was not a big walker. And we were talking about this, and he said to me, by the way, I was doing it for my own entertainment. I had zero intention of writing that book. He could have offered me $50 million, and I would have said no. But I wanted to see what he would do, because we were walking after the book was already #1, and he'd already gotten an advance on the next book of $2.5 million. And I was just interested, was he going to offer me the same, which would have been half? We split the royalties of the first book. And you can imagine, of course, he didn't. But he offered, I think he offered me $850,000. That's my memory. And look,
Your mother said more.
it could have been. It could have been. It could have been. It wasn't way more. It could have been $1 million. Whatever. I mean, listen. You know, you didn't grow up being Jeff Bezos, so $1 million I would assume is meaningful to most of you. You know, I got a great kick out of saying no. In fact, I remember what I said, which was, Donald, I'm like the guy who came to the end of the season in the 7th game of the World Series. I'm in the final inning. The bases are loaded. We're down 3 runs. And I hit a freaking grand slam. And now you are going to suggest that I take a salary cut for next season. Ain't going to happen. But I do remember calling my mother and telling her this, and it is a searing memory that she actually was very dismissive of it. You shouldn't have done one. You shouldn't have done the first one, is what I remember her saying. So it's really nice to know that to others, she was proud.
Tony, over here.
Yes.
Tony, no, over here.
Yes.
Given your focus on the psychology of the person who's become president and your own psychology, are you of the belief that presidential candidates should sort of be officially psychoanalyzed so that we all understand that? And then also, I'm very curious to know if your company ever approached the White House to offer its services, either you or a member of your staff.
Well, I think we could all assume that our services would not be welcomed by the current White House. We did actually do some work in the campaign in some Democratic campaigns. So, no, I do not believe that a president should be psychoanalyzed. I do believe that much as we do mental health evaluations in many areas of government, you know, the FBI does it. That we absolutely should be doing it we should be doing some sort of mental health evaluation. The problem with mental health evaluation is that, you know, it could easily be very politicized. It would be politicized. And it's very tough to create objective criteria for what sufficiently healthy ought to be as president. So I think it's a really difficult question, but I absolutely believe that we need a way of ensuring that we don't end up with presidents whose the severity of mental illness is so great as to threaten the future of civilization, which I do believe is the situation we're in.
Tony, back here.
Your portrait of Donald Trump, his stunted personality, leads me to wonder, and maybe you have too, how he relates to his children.
They are narcissistic objects, is what they call them in psychology. They're there to prop up his very threatened sense of self, and like everybody else in his life, to the degree that they mirror and praise and stand by him, they are valuable to him. To the degree that they in any way didn't do that, they would be cast out just as quickly as many of the people who he has cast out in his administration. And we're going to see, I think, how this plays out, because I think, the odds are very, very high that either Jared or Donald Jr. or both will be indicted. And the question is, what is Donald going to do in the face of that? And my guess is that he will protect himself, not them, and you'll get the answer to how he sees his children there. But I don't believe he sees his children any differently than he sees anyone else.
During what I assume were many asides while you were doing Art of the Deal, what did Donald Trump tell you about his use of Adderall or other drugs in an effort to concentrate? And what did he tell you about, in the context of closing the deal, his sexual conquests?
I don't believe Donald Trump necessarily has ever taken Adderall or any other Ritalin or any other drug. And the reason I say that is, if he has, they've failed miserably. Yeah. I mean, seriously. He has no evidence there's no evidence that even if he were taking the drug that he's able to focus and concentrate in any. Was he snorting when you interviewed him? No, not at all. And believe me, I'm not unwilling to say it, as you can see, if he were. But no, he wasn't. As to sexual conquests, he was a typical male of that era who had that power, so he would always be talking about, that piece of ass, or, the kind of things you would expect to hear in a locker room maybe even today, but certainly in the 70s and 80s. He was having an affair while I was writing the book with Marla Maples. And the interesting thing about that is that I didn't know. Even though she was very much in his life, he kept that secret. I suspect a few people knew. Obviously, a few had to, but he didn't tell me. There was a way of being perceived. He didn't mind being perceived as a liar, but to be perceived as a drug addict or an outright criminal would not be something he would have shared with me.
Jerry Eskenazi. In all the years that I wrote about Trump and dealt with him, and all the people I spoke to, I feel that I was probably the only person that was never screwed by him. And the reason I say that is that everyone I've spoken to, either here at the Silurians or people in business or people in New York, everyone I've ever mentioned his name to has a friend or a relative or a florist or a caterer who was screwed. That said, why has he been so enabled over the years? What does he have that he's able to continue doing this to people? And here he is now.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that. I really believe that it is his sociopathy or sociopathy, meaning that if you have money and power, and you have no relationship to shame or to guilt or to the sense that you don't want to be shunned by others, and you're willing to lie about anything, that's actually an advantage. So, as you've seen, one of the Times say this yesterday about the number of times that, that was about collusion, but the Washington Post keeps track of it, and it's 8,000 or 9,000 times that he's lied. I think that you can easily screw someone if you're in a position of power. You can afford to let them sue you, and you don't care what they say. You're willing to say, that's not true, I did pay you, or you you didn't do the job you were supposed to do. I'll tell you a great irony, because I think Trump I will say this, I think Trump felt closer to me in that era than to almost anyone. And I've tried to share with you why I think some of that might be, but he never screwed me. He's never been late with a payment on royalties. And I do want to say, as part of my absolution, over the last 2 years, I've given away 100% of the $275,000 of or $250,000 of royalties that book has earned, which I now consider to be blood money, so I wouldn't want to have it. But he has paid it dutifully at every turn, and I have been relentless in my criticism of him. So if Trump has a right to feel bad about disloyalty by the way he defines it, I would be a good person to represent disloyalty in his mind.
Over here, please.
Hi, I'm over here. Just a question. Hi. Going forward, sort of looking forward into the administration, just from your insights of having been around him, what's your assessment of what we may expect in the next year or so, especially now that he's gotten some resistance with the Democratic House that's standing firm against him, or at the moment standing firm against him, or providing some opposition. So what do you anticipate?
Well, he is not a complex man. He is a very predictable person, and like so many people, under stress, what he does is he doubles down on what he thinks worked in the past. So the way you're seeing this play out already now is to escalate the attacks, the attempt to discredit the opposition. I mean, the only chance, look, there is no question that Trump, in my mind, so this is not a fact, I'm not a reporter anymore, but there is no question in my mind that Trump has committed a huge number of crimes over the course of his career, and including the period running up to running for president and since he ran for president. So he has only one way out of that, which is to discredit the system that would hold him responsible for that. So what we are going to watch over the next year is whether or not the legal system we put into place will hold up under the relentless kind of attack that he will continue to mount against it. I have felt since 2016, since shortly after he was elected, since Mueller was named the special prosecutor, that Trump would resign eventually the presidency. I'm sorry to say that I no longer think there's a chance that he would resign for any other reason than as a deal with a blend of, Mueller, what Mueller will bring and what the Southern District will bring in order to spare himself prison, because I think there are a lot of people who believe that the moment that Trump leaves office without a deal, the odds are very high that he ends up in prison, and possibly for the rest of his life. So what I expect you to see is a war, and we're already seeing it, and it will escalate. Yes, I believe everybody. I don't believe this. This is obvious. Everybody has a breaking point. So, I've been involved with a group of psychiatrists led by a woman named Bandy Lee from Yale, who's a forensic psychiatrist and has dealt with lots of sociopathic people all her life, who believes that there is a breaking point, there's a moment, and we actually, let me say this, we don't want it to happen, because what happens to people in that situation is that they want to bring as many people down with them as they possibly can before they go. So, when you see the way people around him, even those who understand that he's doing very bad things, treat him with kid gloves, you don't have to be around Trump for more than 5 minutes to know that to attack him or to criticize him is intolerable to him. And if you do it, you're doing it at your own peril.
Okay, I covered him in the 70s. And Ivana ran everything. When did it change? He was always kind of whipped in those days. When did he change?
Yeah, I don't believe that's true. I really don't. She had two jobs. She ran Trump Castle, hard to remember, but that was one of the 3 casinos that he owned, one of the 3 casinos that went bankrupt. And she ran that for a period of time. He loved that because it meant that she was in Atlantic City all week, so he could be with Marla. And then subsequently, she ran the Plaza Hotel. I actually think she was a vastly better operator than he would conceivably have been. Yeah, but he was never an operator. He was, for better or for worse, he was a deal maker and a hustler and a promoter. He was vastly better at that than she was. So I in terms of running businesses for him, it ended when she ended as his wife.
Tony, right beneath you here, I think of you dating back to our days on the Michigan Daily together as a reporter's reporter, really the first of our cohort who went out into the journalism world and started doing great work fresh out of college. I'm wondering when you lost the compulsion to tell a story, to be a journalist, and to what degree your experience with Trump accounts for that.
Well, David, that's a complex question because a lot of factors influenced my decision to leave journalism, not the least of them one that many of you faced, which was journalism was going away. The chance to make a living was diminishing in the face of all the technological change. But here's the primary shift that happened for me is I, like you, spent my years as a journalist being an observer and writing about what other people were doing. And I often found myself believing that I could do it better or that I would like to be doing. Let me just use the word doing. I'd like to be the doer instead of the chronicler. So that was an impulse that would arise in me with some frequency. The other thing was that, my mother died in 1995. I was still a journalist at that point. And I made the career shift 2 years later, and I don't think it's coincidental that my mother's death freed me to be more like her. And my mother was a social activist. My mother was somebody who, and I say this with great love and admiration, wanted to change the world for the better. And I would say to you that I really believe that we are at a time of incredible peril, and it's not just about Trump. It's about climate change. It's about the possibility of a nuclear war. It's about a whole range of social problems that seem so intractable. And my mother was an external activist. She was interested in changing the world by changing institutions and behaviors. I am an internal activist. I really believe that, and we go and say this to companies, the number, 95% of all companies in the Fortune 1000 will say that they have either undergone or are undergoing a transformation, a business transformation. And 80% of those transformations fail. And I believe that the reason is that you can't transform a business without first transforming its people. And the idea of being in, a lot of you are with me and getting older, the idea of being involved in work in which every day I feel that I'm doing what is my own highest and best use to try to save the planet, gives my life a sense of meaning and richness that for all the times I liked and loved journalism doesn't compare, it's incomparable. The experience of being involved in trying to help human beings transform, I can't beat it.
Tony, all the way to your right. Tony, to the right.
Hello, I'm Eileen Barth, and I reviewed The Art of the Deal. for Newsday. I should have gone.
Positively or negatively?
Should have gone back and read it because I don't know. Really, I have no memory of exactly what I said, but I remember very clearly what I thought, and I also was very well aware of the conditions that this kind of book is written under. And what I thought was that Trump was awful, and that you were trying to write a balanced view of somebody who was totally awful. And there was no doubt in my mind that in any way he was an admirable person. After reading your book, which, by the way, I was assigned to review, I would not have chosen this. And therefore, I was also very surprised 2 years ago when you were issuing mea culpas for this book. I thought, he doesn't have that much to apologize for, but I am cynical too. And I also thought, why is he thrusting himself again in the public eye over the name Trump? That the beneficiary was as much you as he in that reawakening of it. But I don't know if anybody here agrees or disagrees or read that book, but I don't think any discerning reader would have found Trump in any way an admirable or even very intelligent individual.
I assume there wasn't a question contained in that.
Tony, does that make you feel better?
I don't have a rejoinder for that one.
Tony, I first want to say that your sense of remorse for writing a book about Trump is probably shared by much of the journalistic world, because we all did stories, myself included, that took this outrageous, flamboyant character without looking too closely at who he really was. And so I just want you to know that. But my question for you is, how has he managed to be so successful without blowing the family fortune?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that he's increased the family fortune. I mean, that's a really important point. He inherited $400 million. It is not clear that he is worth $400 million today. And he inherited that money 30 years ago, and through the magic of compound interest, he should be worth many billions of dollars. I am nearly certain he is not that. So I think he actually has probably done a pretty terrible job of protecting or increasing that family fortune.
2 more questions.
Hi.
Okay, take it back. A lot more questions.
Yes, Tony. I heard you talk about confirmation bias, which explained to me when I read a story about it why people were still supporting this man when he ran for president. But the Republican Party is supporting 90% of the Republican Party is still supporting him. What is you can't say that confirmation bias is what's happening here. What is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there were a clear and simple answer to that question. I mean, listen, he is not the first autocrat, because he's an autocrat, even if he still is operating inside a democracy. He's not the first autocrat by any means who has managed to mesmerize a population. And I think at the deepest level, I think there are certain qualities that Trump has that people find reassuring, which is that they think he's tough and strong and will protect them, even if that's insane. But I do believe there's a significant percentage, probably a third of the country, who believe that. You know, when Nixon resigned, his popularity even then was still at 30 or 35%. It was quite clear that he'd done things that were illegal. But I think what it really is a reflection of is a perverse form of response to the failure of capitalism. in this era, which is to say, any strength overused eventually becomes a liability. Honesty overused becomes cruelty. Confidence overused becomes arrogance. Courage overused becomes recklessness. Capitalism overused becomes 99% of the wealth concentrated in a tiny percentage of the people. And that's where we are. That's just a reality, and that is factual, that a tiny percentage of the people now control most of the money, and we are in true trickle-down economics, and every one of us, I think, at least almost every one of us in this room, are on the wrong side of that equation. And I think the bitterness, the rage, the powerlessness, the hopelessness that people feel, a third of those who are feeling it have vested their hopes in Donald Trump to save them from this outcome. So I think that's the explanation for me.
Hi, good seeing you. I'm Suzanne Charlet. We work
Hello.
together.
My God, there's a New Times alumnus.
Good seeing you again.
You look the same.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I know. Get to the point. You got to the point. My question is back to your book.
This is pretty embarrassing. Probably. Okay. It will
Back
not
to the
happen
art
again.
of the deal. Why, if Donald doesn't like anyone who has criticized him, why did he choose you to write his book if you had just written this awful story about him?
Because he didn't perceive it that way.
And just, what? The question was, why did he ask him to write the book if Tony had written a tough story about him?
You know, I think he's always been good at co-opting his opponents, or less so today, but historically he was. I think he liked that piece. I think he didn't, if you're a sociopath and somebody says you are lying, you don't necessarily consider that bad. And at that time, it wasn't as if he got massive coverage in the press every day. That piece was a cover piece with him a picture of him looking a way that he wanted to be perceived. I think he thought it was a win.
Going back to what is it that Donald Trump has over the Republicans, and do you not think that it is hugely significant that it is fear, that he has a stranglehold over right-wing media, and the right-wing media is now so incredibly pervasive. It is not just the radio talk that's on when the truckers are listening. It is all of this all-night stuff on Fox, and these columnists who now also, and the Russians who are bandying it about even further. It's the ability to reach and amplify the words that will guarantee that any Republican that goes up against him is going to lose their seat in a primary.
I mean, clearly he's got a stranglehold on the Republicans. That's clear. Since there's not going to be any further questions, I do want to say to you, you have a best, you have a worst. Move toward the best. Thank you.
That was amazing, Tony. You've lived up to all of your billing.